Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing The Lynching, the epic courtroom battle that brought down the Klan by Laurence Leamer. It details the murder of Michael Donnell and the criminal and civil trials that followed. In 1981, two white men, Henry Hayes and James Knoll, abducted and tortured the teen in retaliation for another local case that had resulted in two mistrials. Along with other members of the local chapter of the KKK, they felt that if black people could serve in juries and thus allow a black man to kill a white man and live, the reverse should also be fair. Their decision to hunt down and murder McDonald would have a tremendous impact on the organization's financial well-being and thus existence. The book begins and is mostly told from the perspective of the Klan members. It gives some insight into the events that led up to the lynching of Michael Donnell. So pretty much you get some background on the members. Well, actually the most prominent and relevant members of the group and how they came to become members of this local Klan chapter. Benny Hayes was the leader of the local chapter, and honestly, he sounds like a terrible person, like a hot flaming mess to pretty much everyone. Sort of browbeating his family, just not the nicest person. And not that I'd expect him to be as a member of this organization, but it does give some insight into his family dynamic. And then as part of that, how his son Henry became involved with the Klan group, and really just what sounds like a lot of dysfunction within Benny, and as a result of that, how he dealt with his family. There's this thing where here's this person who really doesn't sound like a great guy. I don't remember there being many redeeming qualities mentioned about him. Yet he's surrounded by these people, chiefly his children, and then in some instances, even their romantic partners. I think like his daughter's husband in particular, right? Where this isn't a likable guy, but they go out of their way to try to please him. They fall in line with a lot of the nonsense that he's into. That's not absolving them from anything because they're adults, right? They made their own conscious decisions, but it shows how some people are followers and how easily it is that people, especially those who are weak-minded, can be drawn into things, even things that are heinous, that they themselves don't especially feel passionate about, that this thing of belonging can really drag people into becoming involved with a lot of nonsense. So pretty much what you have here is this group of Klan members in Mobile, Alabama. There was a local case nearby, about a black man who shot I think it was a police officer, a state trooper, something along those lines while committing a robbery. And from their perspective, they got it into their heads that times were changing. If it was possible for a black man to kill a white man in America and get away with it. Now, he had been put on trial, right? But wasn't found guilty. It took place in a different part of Alabama, but was moved to Mobile because of the notoriety of the case, right? A change of venue was deemed necessary. And so with moving the trial to the area, they added their own meaning and connotation to that. And through this became vested in the trial, decided that if the defendant was found innocent, it would essentially be like an eye for an eye kind of thing. Like if a black man in America could get away with, in their perspective, killing a white man, then the same should be fair in reverse. Meaning that as members of the Klan, should he be found not guilty or acquitted, they rationalized it as that they should be able to do the same to a black person. Meaning that they should then, as members of the Klan, be able to kill someone and get away with it, kill a black person and get away with it. It's this thing really of rationalizing that they were really just looking for a reason to kill a black person, because it's explained that up to this point, they had a tendency or a habit. One of their activities as being part of the Klan was joyriding, attacking people, be that black people, gay people, where in just seemingly the days before this vicious attack, this lynching, they attacked a gay man and would have likely killed that individual if it hadn't been for him having the opportunity to run away. And so through different circumstances, they end up really using this trial as an excuse for them to go out and commit acts of violence, this really heinous act of violence against a random black person. But it's something that they've been building up to. I say excuse because it's explained that this is not the first time that they did something like this. This is something that they did what sounds like quite regularly, just randomly attacking people because of their race, their sexual orientation, or some other thing that they deem as being outside the norm or they don't approve of. So it's really just hypocrisy, right? They have all of these stereotypes that they hold about Black people, that they hold about homosexuals. And, one of which is, Black people being criminals, whereas it's then explained that quite a number of the members of this group have some kind of criminal background or, some kind of record. And so it's just this hypocritical thing where obviously you are just looking for a reason to have a problem. With books like this, I find it really insightful where not only do they tell you about the main subjects in the book, meaning the main people and characters in the book or the story, but they also use it as an opportunity to take a broader view and tell you the history of an area. As part of explaining how this group came about and how the city's racial situation developed, it was important to tell the history of Mobile, Alabama. So its past, its more distant past, but then also its recent past. And so I thought it was really insightful to gain an understanding of this particular city's background. It's just a really brief overview. I listened to the audiobook and I think it was maybe about 10 minutes or so that the author gave a really good overview of the history of Mobile in general, but also the experience of Black people, right, back in the Jim Crow era on through the Civil Rights era, and then this now being a few decades later in the early 80s, and how things have changed. Not only how society changed on the surface, because it seems that there was still racial tension brewing beneath, but the people themselves, chiefly Black people, this change in attitude over time. It's regarded as, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was an activist in the area from the Civil Rights generation. And it's like, by the time the lynching takes place in the early 80s, it's explained that lynching had not previously taken place in the area in about 25 years. But yet still people who lived in the area, for some of them, their families probably had lived in other parts of the South. And so while they themselves, the younger generation, might not have personally witnessed or known anyone that had been lynched, they'd certainly heard stories from older family members. And while they hadn't personally experienced these things, they were certainly aware of them. And with the changing of times, having gone through all this and just growing up in a different time, there's a refusal on their part to handle these kinds of situations in the way that they might have been in the past. I think it kind of speaks to the community here. But that brief history that's provided really speaks to the history of Black people in the struggle for rights, for equal rights in America, sort of like the transition through these different eras in the struggle for civil rights prior to and then even past what's regarded as the civil rights movement. So here you have this particular case in this particular city. It serves as kind of taking a far broader view of the bigger civil rights movement and its different eras and whatnot, but boiling it down to this one specific location. It provides some insight into how people on both sides of the equation changed over time, sort of this emerging subtlety of racism, but racism nonetheless. So that's on the part of the segregationists, racist, white supremacists. But then also the other side of that, this rising militancy of some Black people, this transition from the past where the way that was seen as being best for handling racism, for combating racism, was nonviolence and I guess tolerance to a degree, trying as best as you can to survive within the environment, to kind of acquiesce. And here in the more recent present, just there's a refusal to put up with that kind of nonsense, being just as willing to violently, emotionally, and very humanistically push back against these injustices. When I started the book, I had not too long before finished White Rage, which spoke about, in part, Black rage, white rage, where Black rage is sort of what's referred to as when an injustice occurs, there might be riots and things like that afterwards in response from Black people. That's regarded as Black rage. But then this idea of white rage, which is this violent pushback, or sometimes violent pushback, but pushback nonetheless, against any kind of Black progress. And so here you have it in the book that there's a very broad view right? Certainly examples and things like that are provided, but here it's boiled down into this one incident, the lives of this collection of people, this one person that was a victim, this one young man, this one young Black man. And so I just found that really insightful. It helped to humanize the concept of white versus Black rage. So gaining an understanding of, certainly there's some insight into the incident itself, like as far as what led up to and actually occurred. But I really appreciated the time that was spent really delving into Michael Donnell's background, providing a bit of an overview of his mother and his family, which is something that doesn't always happen with true crime books. There's some discussion of the shortcomings of the police, right? Where even at such a late date, I believe this was the 1980s, the local police had this history of some of their members being white supremacists or part of the white supremacist structure, even themselves being involved with the Klan. So it's not initially clear what's going on here, but rather that in the police office being passive, they allow injustices to take place. They help to support this white supremacist structure. And so that's explored here. But with the changing of times where I think he's regarded as being the only or the first Black prosecutor in Southern Georgia. With this guy being in this position and having the case given to him to be handled, right? You then have an individual at the Justice Department who's willing to dig into this, right? And so it's like the stars kind of align to get the right people in place on the side of the prosecution, on the side of trying to seek justice to ensure, or at least to increase the likelihood that this would not become one of those cases of a Black man being randomly murdered by someone and having no justice come from it, having his death be just forgotten and only remembered by his family and loved ones. Given how things progress, you now have this thing of individuals in positions of power within the justice system, within the structure of the justice system, who take care and are actually working actively to get justice for this young man. So the book is actually split into three parts. The first, which focuses on the events leading up to the murder of Michael Donnell and the criminal court case. So the different players, how the case was litigated, investigated, all of that kind of stuff, the different people involved. The other two parts of the book are tied to the case, but place their focus elsewhere. The second part of the book largely focuses on the various players in the court cases. So not really the prosecutor so much, but more so the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a man by the name of Morris Dees. But also politicians that were active at this time. So George Wallace and some of the members of the Klan, more like the top level hierarchy, both at the national level and within the local Klan. So you get a brief biography of each one of these individuals, how they came to be involved with these different organizations, a bit about their ideologies, and really the reality that with them being from, or at least having some ties to Montgomery, their interactions with each other, the evolution of their relationships over time. So, for example, Dees, while he founded the Southern Poverty Law Center, he didn't start out as an activist. He began as a farm boy and through various machinations ended up going off to law school, made a lot of money through a business that he began with a partner. And during this momentous occasion, right, the civil rights movement, even in the midst of it, during the Selma to Montgomery marches, he wasn't very fully involved in the civil rights movement. But you kind of have an explanation of how he slowly became involved. Not even really in the civil rights movement, more so a focus on dismantling the Ku Klux Klan and then other similar organizations that arguably promote and or instigate bringing harm against other people because of their race, sexual orientation, things of that nature. And so it was interesting to get his backstory, sort of how this son of the South went through. I don't think it's accurate to regard it as an awakening because he certainly continued to butt heads with Black citizens in the city, but sort of his political and socially conscious awakening in a way. But then on the other side of the equation, you have the various members of the Klan. So both the national and regional leadership, right, as well as the rank and file members of the group. But you sort of have this telling of how these various people came into interacting with each other surrounding this case, as well as George Wallace, and not his direct involvement, but really how the political and social structure of the South, of Alabama in particular, worked together to subjugate Black people, and how things changed over time. So this lynching took place in 1981, but the book actually goes back far earlier than that to tell the story of these individuals. And with that, it spans several decades, right? Coming more towards the recent present. It really explains how things changed over time. Where in the past with members of law enforcement, government officials, politicians, either being members of the Klan themselves or having relationships with people that were members of the Klan, it created an environment where those relationships created an environment where members of the Klan felt comfortable threatening or even outright murdering Black people and their allies, or people regarded as being their allies. So with that, it's interesting that within just these relative handful of men involved in the Klan, how many different incidents from the civil rights movement they were involved with. So some of them played a role in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Some of them played a role in the murder of, I think her name is Victoria Luzo. You had this lynching as well as other attacks, even just random attacks on Black people, and sort of how the plan and its structure put the battery in the back of these individuals to go out and commit these crimes against Black people and other individuals that they regarded as being fair game. And so as times change, we realize that they're stuck in the past. Some of them over time seem to change. How sincere these changes are is certainly up for debate, because it seems like at least some of them, this change of heart, setting aside their participation and support of the Klan, seem to be a result of them kind of running foul of the law and facing prison time. And so for some, that's what causes them to cut their ties from the Klan. So, which I thought was pretty interesting. I felt the author was at times, I kind of raised an eyebrow, as I felt he was a little bit, not necessarily apologetic, but kind of overly sympathetic to these individuals. Maybe it's a matter of just coming from different backgrounds, as even within the book, some of the individuals, so for example, the Donalds seem to be very willing to forgive their trespassers, for lack of a better term, because of this Christian belief of forgiveness. I'm not at all with that. So having learned about these individuals murdering this young man in cold blood for no reason, just on the off chance that they came across him one night while they were out looking for trouble, and this in addition to the countless other individuals that they just attacked and beat up, I have far less sympathy for them. So there's like one guy who ended up being on death row and being executed. You know, his execution actually reminded me of The Sun Does Shine, where there was a story about a young Black man who was put on death row for a crime that he didn't commit. And he spent several decades on death row until he was ultimately exonerated. And I had a feeling that in passing, he mentioned this guy who was a member of the Klan and had killed a young Black kid, or at least their stories seem to be very similar. And it's like, while, for example, one of the guys who murdered Donald, his father was a leader in the Klan. So if I'm not mistaken, he founded this chapter of the Klan. Really wasn't a nice guy. And that's putting it lightly. And in addition to being hateful towards Black people and people of other races, he was also just a hateful individual within his family and quite a bit of a bully. And as a result of that, he lorded over his children, which had a tremendous impact on the development of his son. In seeking acceptance and respect from his father, that led to him becoming immersed in the Klan, which ultimately resulted in him murdering this young man and being put on death row for it. He was largely unhappy with the person that he'd become. And certainly I don't think that people are born racist. I don't think that people are born evil or mean or anything like that, but rather it's something that they develop into over time. And so his involvement with the Klan, his becoming a racist, was largely influenced by his father. There's no denying that. But I do believe that as adults, we take responsibility for ourselves. And it's unfortunate that he didn't begin to think about breaking away from his father or really assessing his feelings towards his father and his relationship with him until he was on death row. And even there, he was kind of at a loss as to what, if anything, he could do about it. to rectify the situation or to repair his own life. So it was unfortunate for him, but at the same time, I had but so much sympathy, because while it was sad, the relationship between him and his father, and him seemingly kind of being born into this dysfunction that set him on this path, the fact remains that he killed this innocent young man for no reason. And for that, I don't generally support the death penalty, but in this case, and with him having admitted to committing the crime, the third part of the book really focuses on the civil case that was brought against the Klan and these particular members who were directly or indirectly involved in the lynching. And what the goal was here for Dees was serving as representative for the plaintiffs. The legal representative for the plaintiffs he was really trying to focus on how to use the civil lawsuit to effectively break up the Klan. The lynching on its own through the criminal case wasn't enough, because technically there were only 2 people who directly were involved in the murder of Donald. But there were several other people who sort of aided and abetted them, or created the circumstances, provided assistance to them in carrying out this lynching. And so while there might not have necessarily been enough evidence to bring a legal case against them, a criminal case against them, there was enough there to bring a civil lawsuit against them, as the bar for evidence in proving guilt in civil court is lower. So I found that interesting. The third part of the book, you have this exploration, sort of a biography of the different characters, people over the years, and how they got involved in law, how they got involved in the Klan and things like that. And ultimately, how they found themselves on whatever side in the civil case. And so with that, the second part of the book actually has a lot of focus on politics, because it really speaks to how the Klan and law enforcement, as well as politicians, work together, how those relationships really help to enforce the structure of segregation and inequality. The first and the second parts of the book, because they focus on the criminal court case, and then the third on the civil court case, there's a lot more focus on the courtroom proceedings, the investigation, gathering of evidence, and things like that, and then the actual proceedings in court. Fortunately, in both cases, the prosecution and the plaintiff in the civil case were able to get guilty verdicts, right? They were victorious. So the jury, for the death of this young man, I believe the judgment was awarded $7 million. So fortunately, the prosecution and the plaintiff were victorious in both cases, and a jury awarded, I believe the judgment was $7 million for the death of this young man, which the Klan and its members did not have. But in finding that judgment against them, it helped to weaken, if not arguably cripple, the organization, because at this point, it's like it's no longer granted Klan leadership plausible deniability in instances where lower-ranking members went out and committed crimes against individuals. Their racist rhetoric, their calls for violence, or implied calls for violence could be used against them in court. But at the same time, once you realize the Klan isn't around, I don't know how large or effective it is. It's not something I keep up with, but I think of these kinds of cases of the litigation, it kind of led to where you now have these militia groups, these hate groups and whatnot, but they're more underground. They're less open in the public with it. And then also you have a lot more, I guess, what could be termed lone wolves. So individuals who have, whatever ideology, but they may or may not be part of a larger group. And even in being part of a larger group, they kind of operate on their own. So even in the event that they commit some kind of crime or atrocity, it's typically like they might consume racist rhetoric that's put out by particular organizations and outlets, but they're not necessarily acting under the specific guidance or direction of a leader. And so there's this thing of progress, right? You can't really say one way or another which is better or which is worse than the other, but I do recall that towards the end of the book, it's mentioned that Dees, I think, was like celebrating the unveiling of the Civil Rights Monument at the Southern Poverty Law Center headquarters. And he prosecuted the civil case, right? Some lamented the idea of Black people, especially young Black people, believing that things haven't changed in comparison to past. And I understand the sentiment. I think that the circumstances we live under are tremendously different from back in the 50s, 60s, and even earlier. And so an argument can be made that we're not living in a post-racial society. I think at this point, if we're being honest with ourselves, we can get rid of that idea. But rather that some of these ideologies and beliefs are now regarded as being politically incorrect. And so people are less willing to share them publicly, but it doesn't mean that they don't still hold those feelings, that they don't still have these perspectives. It doesn't mean that because we've moved through the civil rights movement and people have provided donations and things like that. They might have served on juries. That doesn't mean that they're no longer racist. That doesn't mean that they no longer hold racist views and ideas. And it certainly doesn't mean that Black people and other marginalized groups aren't still disadvantaged or being subjugated. It might not be in the same form that it was in the past or prior to the civil rights movement, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of progress that needs to be made. And so I certainly understand this perspective, but I understood the perspective of young people that he was taking issue with. So in reading this book, I think you should go into it. I was a little caught off guard by the second part of the book because it's actually pretty long and it really delves deeply into the politics of Alabama as far as the social and political structure of Alabama, how it was that this system of segregation, oppression were allowed to thrive and exist. And not just that, but the Klan as well. But it went on a lot longer than I thought it would. I guess like the first part of the book, which focused on the criminal case, the investigation of the lynching, I assumed that the bulk of the book would focus on that. And it does, and it does a pretty good job. But just be prepared that the second part of the book, it takes a different path. Just, be aware so you're not caught off guard by it. I think it's still a pretty good book overall, but just be prepared that it's going to kind of shift focus a little bit in the middle. But all in all, I still think it's a book that's worth checking out. The only thing is that assessed on a case-by-case basis, the books and movies and things like that I review and discuss, because here it is that certainly Michael Donnell is a prominent figure in the story, as his lynching kind of sparks all of this stuff, right? And is at the center of the book. But just keep in mind that this book is not about him, or not just about him, right? The book is not about Black people as individuals or even as a group, but rather it's about the system of oppression and segregation, inequality and whatnot that existed in Alabama and arguably still exists in Alabama. So it's less specifically about Black people, but rather how the people, philosophies, law, and social customs of the time created a society that aided in the oppression of Black people. And so for that reason, I think it's definitely worth checking out. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.